We have another interesting show for you today. We have in studio Russ Gugino with me, but on the phone we are going to have Roger Stone. So Roger's consented to be with us for this entire hour, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with Roger. I've gotten to know Roger probably 20 years ago. He is an extremely, extremely interesting guy who's been involved in well over 9 presidential campaigns since the 70s. But Roger has a reputation of being a political trickster. It all started when Roger was actually 8 years old in 1960 in elementary school. He was in favor of JFK, and he went around and told his fellow students that if you vote for Nixon, Nixon wanted to have school on Saturdays. And that was the first in how he started. But interestingly, in 1972, at the age of 20, he started to work for Richard Nixon. And he's worked for several presidents since Richard Nixon. He is very close with Donald Trump. We're going to talk today about a number of different national issues and then some state issues. So, Roger, good morning. How are you today?
Ralph, it's great to be with you. Of course, great to be good with my old friend Russ Gugino. We worked together for one of the greatest Americans, who, by the way, belongs in the Football Hall of Fame, Jack Kemp.
Yep.
And just to give your listeners some context, in 1960, of course, I came from a Catholic family. I'm a proud Roman Catholic.
Yes.
My parents were Republicans, but I think they were conflicted because, of course, John F. Kennedy, an ardent anti-communist, was our first Catholic presidential candidate and our first Catholic president. There was a mock election in the elementary school in Westchester County, New York, where I grew up. And, yes, I stood at the end of the cafeteria line. As each kid went by, I said, oh, by the way, if Nixon is elected, there will be school on Saturdays. That was my first experience with disinformation within politics, and of course, I've never used it since then.
Well, very, very interesting. Look, I know how capable and competent you are. I've seen it firsthand in a number of circumstances. I saw you with our own Carl Palladino in 2010, how you orchestrated his primary win. I've always been a fan of what you were able to accomplish and what your knowledge is. So let's get into it. Like you said, let's talk about that for a second. So you were raised Catholic. Your mother was Italian, I understand. So you were raised in a Catholic family. Tell me about what you think the situation is with Donald Trump and the Pope, with this situation that goes on.
Well, let me say before we get there that Carl Palladino is one of the finest men, one of the finest patriots I've ever known.
Yes.
And he was actually, after the Republican primary, after he vanquished Congressman Rick Lazio, as we used to call him, in the Republican primary, he was briefly leading Andrew Cuomo, and then his campaign collapsed when he said 3 things. He said that Andrew Cuomo was a shameless womanizer, that Sheldon Silver, the Speaker of the Assembly, was a crook, and that the Senate Majority Leader, whose name escapes me at the moment, was also a crook. By the way, Carl turned out to be right about all 3 of those things.
Yep.
Andrew Cuomo was removed from office because of his assaults on women. Sheldon Silver went to prison because he was a crook. And the Senate Majority Leader, Dean Skelos, he also went to prison because he was crook. So Carl was 3 for 3. He's a great man who always speaks his mind. I have a deep affection for him. And when Robert Mueller and the deep state targeted me, not because I did anything wrong, but because they wanted to pressure me into testifying falsely against Donald Trump. They spent $30 million. They couldn't find any Russian collusion, so they wanted to invent it, and they wanted me to be the ham in their ham sandwich, and I refused. Do I look like Michael Cohen to you? Because there was no way I was ever doing that. So I'm proud of my record. You know, one man's dirty trick is another man's civic participation. I'm proudest, of course, of my role in the election of Ronald Reagan. I worked for him in 1976 when it was a small and hearty band of loyalists. Again in 1980 when he drubbed George H.W. Bush, and then, of course, in his massive reelection in 1984.
Yes.
It was in 1979 that I met Donald Trump. I pitched he and his father into joining Ronald Reagan's finance committee. You know, for those who say Trump's not a conservative, that's not true. He was with us then. It was one of our biggest fundraisers for Ronald Reagan. I'm particularly, I guess if I have to point to anything in my political career, in addition to my friendship and my early advocacy of a Trump candidacy, I mean, Ralph, I was urging him to run for president as early as 1988, again in 2000, again in 2012, and then, of course, in 2016, we finally came to the point where the man and the times were exactly right. And I think even if he had not made the greatest comeback since Grover Cleveland, the only other president to serve one term, be cheated out of re-election to come back to win again, a New Yorker, I might add, even if he had not come back to a second term, he still would have gone down in history as one of our greatest presidents. And now I believe, despite the fact that there's a lot of panicins in our party, that we are still headed to a golden age of peace, prosperity, security, and law and order. That day is coming, and I'm convinced that he will go down in history as perhaps our greatest president.
Roger, this is Russ. The original question was, what do you think of Trump's comments about the Pope? Do you think they'll have any lasting effect, or do you think he'll just fade into the woodwork?
Well, first of all, I think the last real Pope was Benedict, in all honesty. I think the once great Roman Catholic Church, which was a bulwark of communism. I watched Father Fulton Sheen on TV growing up in northern Westchester. But the Catholic Church has become captive of a progressive Marxist elite. The last Pope was a disgrace. I'm sorry, Your Eminence, but nowhere in the Bible does it say Christ didn't believe in private property rights. Nowhere, although he said that repeatedly. I just use that as one example. This Pope, I think, should stick to matters of religious dogma. I mean, he should not be commenting on whether we should allow dangerous, illegal immigrants, criminals, into our country. We don't tell the Pope about God. The Pope should not tell us about immigration policy. I don't think that it will make much difference, in all honesty. I don't see this as an issue that will impact the 2026 elections. It might have been better if the president had let it go, but the Pope should stick to spiritual matters. On issues like life and transgenderism and LGBT, the Pope is very solid on those social issues, but I think he should stay out of American politics.
You know, I have a client from Iran whose family is persecuted over there, and he stopped in my office this week, and he's 1,000% in favor of what Trump is doing. When I ask him about these situations, he tells me how many people the Iranian government has killed of their own people, hundreds of thousands of people, for political reasons, for religious reasons. So it's a terrible regime. Every president has said it in the last, several presidents, and yet it took Trump to do something about it. So I totally agree with what you just said.
Well, and in all honesty, there's such thing as consistency. Donald Trump has said since 1988 that Iran can never be allowed to have a nuclear bomb. The Iranians are not like, say, the Japanese or the Germans in World War II, where, yes, they wanted to destroy America, but they wanted to live. These people don't care whether they live or not.
That's unfortunately true.
They think that there's some great martyrdom in which, if they give their life for Allah, they will be presented with 17 Vestal virgins. So this is a very dangerous enemy. The brutality of this regime, the way they treat their own people, is beyond anything I've ever seen. I watched this great video. I think it was on the Sunday Times of London of these brave patriots just before they were hung, singing patriotic songs and defying the regime. These are courageous, brave people, but they picked a fight with the wrong guy. Donald Trump will not lose this war. I would like it to be over as quickly as possible, as I think all Americans would. And I think it will be over relatively quickly. I think the idea of blockading their harbors, he has devastated their military. It's only a matter of time before the military, the police, and the people, due largely to the lack of food. You know, when people are hungry, they do courageous and dangerous things. I think it's only a matter of time before the regime collapses entirely.
Do you have a concern that for these midterm elections, obviously you see the approval rating of Trump has dropped, and it's blamed on price of gas, blamed on this war that we have, $25 billion. While I am in total agreement with what you said, I think getting this thing accomplished is what needs to be done. But what effect is it going to have on midterm elections?
I think it's a little too early to say. The electorate is extraordinarily volatile. This decision last week by the U.S. Supreme Court,
yes,
which says that you cannot use race to draw congressional districts, I think is going to have a profound impact. I think that could gain us as many as 19 seats in the South. My home state of Florida, we will pick up 4 Republican-leaning seats. By the way, when we do this, we do it based on population. When they do it, they just simply gerrymander. And the truth is, every place they can draw favorable districts, like California, Illinois, New York, they've already done so. So it's going to be very hard for them to invent new districts that would produce Democrat nominees. I also think you should recognize that the Republicans will have an enormous financial advantage. We will have somewhere between $6 and $8 billion to spend between all party committees and the president's super PACs, whereas the Democrats are still deeply in debt. And then you come back to the fundamental question that is that they have no platform for America. They are running solely on the idea that they hate Donald Trump.
Yeah.
They have no plan to create jobs. They have no plan to create inflation, to control inflation. They have no plan to expand affordable housing and make it more available. They have no plans for energy independence. In fact, they would return to our being dependent on foreign energy because they would go back to blocking the exploration, drilling, and fracking of oil here in the United States. They literally have no plan. They're running on Trump derangement syndrome. That's not much of an issue.
Roger, let me ask you about the reapportionments. Are those in various states going to be in effect for this November, or will legal challenges postpone those changes?
I think most of them will be in place for this election. The ones in Florida certainly will be. I do think that what they did last week in Virginia could be delayed. They put a constitutional amendment on the ballot. It was extraordinarily misleading. Right now, Virginia has 6 Democrats, 5 Republicans. Under their map, it would become 10 Democrats, 1 Republican. I think that tells you a lot right there. That has been stayed temporarily by the state courts. We'll see what happens there. It's very sad. Virginia, which was once a reliably conservative state, has really moved left as the Washington suburbs and the Richmond suburbs have become more and more liberal.
Roger, we're going to have to take a break right now, but I do want to come back and talk a little bit more about this Supreme Court decision in this Louisiana case. I want to explain to our people exactly what happened there and why it was the right thing to accomplish. Roger, again, I want to explain to our people what actually happened in this Supreme Court case that involved Louisiana and their congressional maps. So from the civil rights movement, there was this affirmative action in terms of how congressional seats were drawn. And what this Supreme Court decision did was put back what has always been the case, what's supposed to be the case. It you don't put one group above the other. And that's what was being done. They were putting minorities above everyone else. And now the Supreme Court has held that that's unconstitutional. One group doesn't get put above another. It's all even. Isn't that what the decision really means?
Yeah, I mean, we're supposed to have a colorblind society.
Exactly.
Making decisions on the basis of race or gender is unconstitutional. Look, as you know, I worked for President Nixon
yes.
before I worked for President Reagan. President Nixon, they talk about the Southern strategy. It was Nixon who desegregated the public schools, not Kennedy, not Johnson. It was Nixon who gave us affirmative action, which many of my conservative friends opposed, saying that there should be no preferences based on race. It was also Nixon who, by the way, appointed more African Americans to federal office than LBJ and JFK combined. And who quadrupled the funding for black colleges, who increased 9 times the funding for civil rights enforcement by the Department of Justice. So when they talk about the Southern strategy, what exactly are they talking about? There would never have been a 1958 civil rights bill, the first civil rights bill passed since the Civil War, but for Richard Nixon as vice president, rounding up the votes. And, of course, leading the opposition was that great civil rights advocate, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who killed every civil rights piece of legislation, anti-lynching bills, fair housing bills, voter registration bills in the Senate throughout the 1950s.
That's not what people understand. It's amazing to me because you just spoke the truth. You just spoke the statistics. You can find it in the history books, yet that's not what people believe at this point. They believe the Democrats did all of this when clearly it wasn't the case. But this Supreme Court decision, this 6-3 Supreme Court decision, rights the wrong. And now it is colorblind. But now the question is, can it be accomplished in the short time frame that we need for this midterm election?
Well, I mean, you're an attorney, one that I have huge respect for, but this is a Supreme Court decision. So to whom would you appeal it?
There is no appeal. This is it. This is the law.
That is correct, which is why I think you're going to have a more honest and fairer election, at least when it comes to redistricting. If there's anything that's illegal, and it'll probably end up before the Supreme Court before it's over, it is that heist in Virginia. What's interesting, by the way, is how close that vote was. Republicans made almost no effort. Democrats poured a lot of resources in there. They won very, very narrowly. And if you followed it through the night, they were losing throughout the night. And only in the wee hours of the morning did they pull ahead. I think they won by 30,000 votes. That's actually a good sign because today, sadly, Virginia, a state I lived in for a while, has become a liberal stronghold.
Roger, one of the examples in Louisiana that was, I think, identified by the Supreme Court was a very, very narrow strip that was a congressional district that went from the very northwest section of Louisiana all the way down to the southeast side of Louisiana, throughout the entire state. And it was done strictly because to pick up African-American votes. There was no community there. It just literally went right through the entire state in a small swath. And when the Supreme Court took a look at that, they said, well, obviously, this is being done on the basis of race, not on the basis of community interest. And that, I think, led to the decision that they made that this has got to stop. So the idea that the Democrats keep calling this Jim Crow 2, why don't you let our listeners know what exactly are they trying to pin on the Supreme Court?
Well, I mean, look, in all instances, and I think this is one of the reasons why there was yet another attempt on the president's life last Saturday night, is this constant denigration that if you believe in conservative principles, if you believe in America first, that somehow makes you a white supremacist, a bigot, an extremist, a Nazi, a Klansman. Are they calling Clarence Thomas the African American Supreme Court justice? Are they saying he's a racist? I mean, it's just name calling. But the Supreme Court has spoken. See, they love Supreme Court decisions and they love federal court decisions when they go their way.
Right.
But when they don't go their way, oh, the judge is incompetent, the judge should be removed. But when I say a federal judge should be removed, they go out of their mind. Oh, you don't respect the federal judiciary. By the way, federal judges are not infallible. They may have lifetime appointments, unless they, of course, are impeached. And that's been very rare. Here in Florida, we have one of the few federal judges who was impeached for corruption, which is really the only reason you can remove them. It's a shame that federal judges cannot be removed for their willful and repeated violation of the canon of ethics, because I think they should be able to be impeached for that purpose, but that's really not the way it works.
So let's move to the assassination attempt, the third assassination attempt. What do you make of this? How bifurcated are we as a country?
Look, we don't even have the answers about the Kennedy assassination. I mean, I wrote a New York Times best-selling book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, the case against LBJ. You can go to stonezone.com and get a signed copy of it.
Yep.
Get the paperback if you choose to buy it elsewhere. I mean, you can go to Amazon if you want to give your money to a multinational corporation that hates your guts. You can go buy my book on Amazon. But if you go to stonezone.com, you get the paperback version. Has 3 extra chapters. I make a compelling case that LBJ was the head of a plot that involved the Central Intelligence Agency, organized crime, Big Texas Oil, Wall Street banks, and others to remove Kennedy. Kennedy was a hardline anti-communist. He was demanding a silver or gold-backed dollar, and he was opposed to Israel getting nuclear weapons. I think those were all factors in his assassination, and I've written about it extensively. As far as the president is concerned, I'm sorry, but I don't believe that Thomas Matthew Crooks acted alone in Butler, Pennsylvania. Why was his body immediately cremated, even though his family did not request that? Why did they hose down the roof of the building from which he shot? Why did he was spotted by citizens, dozens of citizens yelling, "Look, up on the roof, a man with a gun." They knew for 90 minutes he was inside the perimeter of Trump's rally, yet no one informed Trump's direct Secret Service detail. The state, local, and county police were all on different radio frequencies from the Secret Service. That makes no sense. He was first shot. The shooter was shot by a sheriff's deputy who kind of knocked him back. Why did the counter shooter from the Secret Service wait until Crooks or whoever he was got off 8 rounds before he killed him? He should have killed him immediately. He had a gun, and he was pointing it at the President of the United States. These are all troubling questions. I don't believe Crooks acted alone. I don't believe that they couldn't crack his cell phone. They say, his cell phone was encrypted. Really? My cell phone was encrypted. Apple turned over all my records to the FBI and to Robert Mueller without even getting a warrant. So I don't believe that they couldn't get into his phone. That they can get into anyone's phone they want to. This is something I pray about constantly, the safety of our president. I think he takes too many chances. After Butler, he fired the head of the Secret Service. I agree with that. But then he appointed a guy from his own detail who may be a great guy, but I don't know that he's capable of doing this job. The president loves to play golf, but when he's out on a golf course, he's a target. I know he's going to the PGA today in Doral. Probably going to meet him there for dinner tonight. I pray for his safety every single day. They have now really tried, not 3, but 4 times, if you count the guy who stormed the gate at Mar-a-Lago weekend when the president wasn't there with a loaded shotgun, and they shot and killed him, which they had every right to do once he penetrated the perimeter. So I continue to be concerned about this because I think they will keep trying. They demonstrated in the Arctic Frost operation, and thanks to Tulsi Gabbard, who I think has a great future. Not since Jack Kemp have I been as impressed with any political leader as I am with Tulsi Gabbard, a decorated war hero who served her country in combat in Afghanistan, former Democrat congresswoman, now a Republican. She declassified all the documents that proved there was no Russian collusion. It was a seditious conspiracy in which Barack Obama and Joe Biden and John Brennan, the CIA director, and James Comey, the FBI director, and Susan Rice, the National Security Director, and Rod Rosenstein, the acting attorney general, and the late Robert Mueller, who I guarantee you is in a much warmer place right now, that they engaged in a seditious conspiracy. And because that conspiracy starts in Washington, D.C., goes through Russian collusion, goes through 2 phony impeachments, which Tulsi Gabbard's also released the classified documents that prove that. The cute little Vindman brothers, they both lied under oath. And then, of course, the theft of the 2020 election. But it ends with the raid in Mar-a-Lago, which puts this matter in the jurisdiction of South Florida, where the U.S. attorney here should drag all of those people in front of a grand jury and charge them.
Roger, do you think that...
And by the way, there is no statute of limitations on seditious conspiracy.
That's right.
Roger, do you think that the current acting attorney general is finally going to get to the bottom of some of these tales of either incompetence or conspiracy?
Well, things seem to be moving in the right direction. Look, I like Pam Bondi. She's a friend of mine. I was disappointed that there was no action. Now the acting attorney general, Todd Blanche, has indicted James Comey, threatening, the life of the president is a more serious crime than what they charged me with. But it's interesting. Comey and I were both charged initially with the exact same crime, lying under oath to Congress. Now, in order to violate the False Statements Act, your statement has to be both willful, and Ralph will understand this because he's an attorney, and material.
That's right.
So when the judge said to me in sentencing, you have been convicted of lying to cover up for Donald Trump, I say, lying about what? The Russian collusion that didn't exist? There was no motive to lie. I had no purpose to lie. I was railroaded in a Soviet-style show trial, really, because I refused to cooperate and testify falsely against Donald Trump. I passed 3 separate lie detector tests, one by the company that the FBI uses, another one the company that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement uses on that narrow question. At my trial, my defense attorneys asked for Robert Mueller's full, unredacted report, and the judge refused to give it to us. Said she would read the report in her chambers, in camera, and give us the sections relevant to me. Funny, she forgot page 168, where it specifically says they found no evidence of Russian collusion, no evidence of WikiLeaks collaboration, and no other crime on my part. So I was framed to pressure me into testifying against Trump, and it is only through the grace of God and my return to the church and my being redeemed in the blood of the cross that I'm with you today.
Roger, do you think that the trial that will take place with Comey being in North Carolina would maybe change the outcome as opposed to having it being in Washington, D.C.?
It's certainly a fairer jurisdiction in North Carolina, a state that's voted 3 times for Donald Trump. You might actually get an unbiased judge. You might actually get a fair jury there. I can tell you in D.C., how is it possible that my jury had not a single Republican, not a single independent, did have veterans of the Clinton administration, veterans of the Obama administration on the jury. The judge ruled that previous support for Democrats and Democrat activism was not a reason for you to be knocked out as a juror. And, of course, the grand jury forewoman in my case testified during jury selection and during the trial that she never heard of me. She didn't know who I was. She knew nothing about the case. Turned out that she'd been attacking me and Donald Trump for 19 months straight, specifically about this case on social media, but she had that on a private setting, so my lawyers didn't see it when they did due diligence on the jurors. I should have been entitled at a minimum to a new trial, but a new trial in D.C. would have come out the same way as the first trial. They deny you any plausible defense. I could prove that the Democrat National Committee was never hacked by the Russians or anyone else. I could have used forensic evidence and expert testimony to prove that, but that was denied because the underpinning of my indictment was this falsehood that the DNC had been hacked by the Russians, and the Russians had somehow gotten that information to the Trump campaign through me, for which there is no evidence or proof whatsoever.
Roger, Russ wants to reminisce a little bit about Jack Kemp. So you were involved with Kemp. Go ahead, Russ.
Well, I was Jack's administrative assistant during a time in the early 80s where Roger was part of a very big and prestigious law firm, consulting firm in Washington, and I had the privilege of working with Roger on one of Jack's campaign, and of course, to some extent, his presidential ambitions. But I wanted to let the listeners know that Roger was a guy that people said, gee, he attracts lightning, this guy. He is very controversial, and I finally figured it out that Roger doesn't really attract lightning. He is the lightning. And in that respect, I could tell you that he's the reason why Democrats hate him is because they envy him. They wish they were as talented as Roger Stone. So I just wanted you to know, Roger, today, May the 2nd, is the 17th anniversary of Jack Kemp's passing, today. And I think it's interesting that both of us who did a lot with Jack can remember him kindly. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think Jack Kemp's legacy is in American politics?
Jack Kemp was a great man who changed his party. Jack Kemp put principle ahead of his own ambition. He could have been a U.S. senator. He could have been governor. But he put all that aside because he believed in growth economics and he believed in civil rights, two things he felt very strongly about. He was a great, great congressman. One thing I do want to talk about, because we don't have much time left, and that is the incredible endorsement by President Donald Trump of Anthony Constantino, the businessman, for the open seat of Elise Stefanik in upstate New York.
That's where I was.
Remember Anthony.
That's certainly where I was headed next, Anthony, New York.
Anthony is the guy who came from nothing, built a multi-million-dollar online printing business, and in the 2024 election, he put a giant sign on top of his factory in Amsterdam, New York, and the local Democrat mayor wanted to throw him in jail, literally wanted to throw him in jail. They fined him $1,000 a day because he refused to take the sign down. He's not a politician. He's a businessman, solid Trump supporter. Being fined $1,000 a day, that's $365 a year because he refuses to take the sign down. The president endorsed him over the objections of Ed Cox and the Republican establishment and liberal Republican Congressman Mike Lawler from the Mid-Hudson Valley. That's the district I grew up in. Mike's got a tough race. He got to stick to his own knitting. I must say, though, I'm very disappointed in the Conservative Party because they have endorsed a guy named Robert Smullen. Smullen was arrested in 2018 for first-degree felony of filing false veterans tax exemption paperwork, and somehow he got that busted to disorderly conduct. Ralph, you're a lawyer. Explain to me how that works.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's his voting record. He voted in favor of extending the statute of limitations so that E. Jean Carroll could sue Donald Trump for alleged sexual assault that never happened. Smullen voted yes for the Office of Racial Equality and Social Justice. He voted yes on transgender and gender non-binary wellness programs in New York State. He voted yes on mandatory LGBT training for home health aides. He voted yes on chief sustainable officer to oversee the climate change bureaucracy in New York State. He voted yes on decriminalizing prostitution. He voted yes on replacing councilmen with council member, and he voted no on requiring warrants to search electronic devices. He's endorsed by the ultra-left New York State Teachers Union. This is who the Conservative Party has endorsed. This makes no sense to me. I remember the purposes of the Conservative Party back when the Republican Party was run by Jacob Javits and Nelson Rockefeller and then John Lindsay, who was a Republican. But how do you endorse a candidate with a voting record like this is almost beyond me. The president has now spoken, and I don't want to put this seat at risk. But under your rules, Ralph, the State Executive Committee allegedly makes this decision. In Anthony Constantino, you have a pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, pro-Trump candidate, endorsed by Trump himself and endorsed by Mayor Rudy Giuliani, a solid conservative in a 14-plus district. But if the votes are divided between a Republican and a conservative who will run far behind because the guy can't raise $5. By the way, Constantino is completely and totally financing his own campaign. In other words, you can't buy him, you can't bully him, you can't boss him. He's put $7 million into his own campaign. He won't take any money from any special interest or any PAC. So big pharma and big food and big agriculture and big banks and big insurance companies, they're out of luck. Anthony Constantino is nobody's man but yours, and he's going to win that seat. I really hope the conservatives come to their senses, and endorse the conservative candidate.
So you know that I talked to Anthony Constantino a number of times. I sent out an email to my counterparts in the Conservative Party, the chairman in that congressional district, on his behalf. I've spoken on his behalf. But look, the way things work is if he is the winner in the Republican primary, which I expect he will be the winner in the Republican primary, then I do expect that the way the law is now in New York, the other party, if Sullivan can get off of the conservative line, and we can then be again united in the final November election.
So I'm hopeful that that's the way that it will work out. Your chairman, Jerry Kassar, who I think has wandered far from the principles of the party, has kind of indicated that won't happen. I hope he comes to his senses because every single House seat is going to count in this election.
Exactly.
I think that, I think it's going to be vital. I can tell you right now, a poll that was just taken shows Constantino leading Smullen 57-9. So this idea that Anthony is going to put the seat at risk, there are some congressmen in New York who are saying that, like this guy Garbage Reno from New York, from Long Island, who's never with Donald Trump. Mike Lawler, who's a nice enough fellow, but he's got a tough race of his own. This is the guy who beat Sean Patrick Maloney. I grew up in that district. At one time, I was crazy enough to want to be a congressman from that district. That's a district that was represented by Hamilton Fish, where he was challenged in the Republican primary by one G. Gordon Liddy. That's how well I know that district. But
wow.
He had to stick to his own knitting. These Long Island congressmen had to worry about their own seats. Beyond that, it appears to me like Bruce Blakeman, who's a nice enough fellow, will be the nominee of the Republican Party, but he's pro-abortion, which I don't think sits well in the New York State.
Did we lose you? Okay, hold on a second. We've got to bring Roger back. So, okay, we will get Roger back on the phone in just a second, so we'll see what happened there. Obviously, Roger's very involved in this situation. He had called me before about Anthony Constantino. I had talked to him. He certainly, Anthony Constantino certainly says all the right things. He touches all of the right buttons in terms of what we believe in. It is important, obviously, again, in this midterm election, to make sure the Congress and the Senate have a Republican majority. So did we lose Roger? Okay. So it's certainly critical that the election this year is about giving Trump his majority in both the House and the Senate. Everybody needs to get out and vote. Let me see if we can reach Roger.
One of the things that our listeners would be interested in is what the impact of what's going on in Iran and other parts of the world, how it impacts New York State. Well, it's going to be a very vigorous election for sure. And even though Bruce Blakeman hasn't been in Erie County very, very much, the speculation is, more than speculation, is that he will be coming to Erie County in western New York quite a bit, probably beginning around Memorial Day and constantly throughout the rest of the campaign. Bruce Blakeman is trying to obviously unseat Kathy Hochul, who has been a very
he's texted me.
Has been a very
Call back, he said.
Strong influence on people leaving the state in droves. You may remember that Kathy Hochul had indicated some years ago that people like Lee Zeldin and Greg Molinaro and a few others who were running for office, they should go to Florida. They should leave and never come back. And not too long ago, Kathy Hochul was basically begging people who have moved to Florida to come back to New York or at least send checks. So the atmosphere in New York State is very poor with regard to the outlook. I want to give you one example of that. J.P. Morgan Chase is the biggest bank in the world. They have 300,000 people living and working in New York City. Did you know that 700,000 employees of J.P. Morgan Chase are living in Texas and working in Texas? That's going to continue as long as the taxes and the regulations and the anti-business climate continues in New York. So keep an eye on that. Keep an eye on what's happening both on the Republican line but also on the conservative line.